Marcus Rowley didn't choose the heart of the city for charm or nostalgia. He chose it for the bones. The building his flagship store occupied was solid. Brick, steel, hardwood laid by craftsmen long gone. It had stood through fires, bankruptcies, and changes of power, and Marcus respected that kind of resilience. He had learned early in life that the most reliable foundations weren't made of marketing, charisma, or even vision. They were made of structures that didn't yield, even when history twisted around them. That's what drew him to this building. Not the romantic idea of running a boutique or the lure of foot traffic. It was the architecture, the stubbornness of stone, the way the walls seemed to remember everything but refused to speak. He had taken over the space nearly 10 years ago when the previous tenant, a tired antique dealer with bad knees and tax debt, decided to leave the business. Marcus bought not just the lease but the entire commercial unit outright. He'd walked the property line a dozen times, read the deed line by line, personally oversaw the survey. He was methodical, measured, and borderline obsessive about ownership. He didn't just want a shop, he wanted dominion. That store wasn't just his business. It was his anchor, his statement. Everything inside, from the imported walnut shelves to the custom lighting, had been chosen by him. No investors, no consultants. Every inch of it bore his fingerprint. The storefront was discreet. A simple black metal sign above the entrance read, Rowley. No descriptor, no branding fluff. He believed that if you had to explain what you were, you probably weren't worth finding. Inside, the atmosphere was as deliberate as a museum exhibit. Quiet music, earthy scents, curated inventory, and staff trained not to pitch but to observe. It wasn't just about selling things. It was about control, about presence. Customers didn't browse so much as move through the space the way they might a gallery. Every item was there for a reason. Every shift in lighting was timed. Most people respected that. The regulars, a blend of corporate professionals, architects, and collectors, valued what Marcus had built. Some came for the exclusivity, others for the quiet. And Marcus, in his reserved way, took satisfaction in the ritual of it all. He opened the store himself each morning. He did the first walkthrough. He reviewed the books weekly. This wasn't a hobby or a side hustle, it was a fortress of self-definition. That's why, when the door opened one chilly Tuesday afternoon and she walked in like she owned the air, Marcus noticed immediately. The woman was maybe in her late 50s, with perfectly set platinum blonde hair, a camel-colored cashmere coat that draped more than fit, and a handbag that looked less like an accessory and more like a declaration of lineage. She didn't look around, didn't take in the displays. She walked straight toward the center of the store, heels striking the hardwood like a challenge, and stopped. Just stood there as if expecting the room itself to acknowledge her presence. Marcus, who had been adjusting the height of a newly mounted sculpture base, lifted his head but didn't move. The woman turned toward him with the kind of smile that predated conflict. A practiced, brittle gesture that said, "I've already decided you're wrong." "I assume you're the manager?" she said, voice smooth but clipped. "No," Marcus said calmly. "I'm the owner." Her smile didn't falter. In fact, it seemed to sharpen. "Well, that's unfortunate," she replied, stepping closer. "Then you'll be the one I need to speak to directly." He gestured toward the seating area near the front window, where customers occasionally waited during consultations, but she ignored it. "This space," she continued, "was improperly transferred decades ago. The transaction was never resolved properly. My family owns this property, always has, and I'm here to see that it's returned to the rightful line." Marcus blinked once. "Are you referring to a specific document?" he asked evenly, suppressing the irritation that was building under his collarbone. "There was no formal sale," she said, ignoring the question. "It was seized through questionable channels when my father was in the hospital. My mother was never consulted. And now I come in here and, well, look at it. You've gutted it." "I purchased this property 10 years ago," Marcus said, voice steady. "The sale was clean. I have the deed, the survey, and the title history. Everything is on record." She waved her hand dismissively as if that sort of thing didn't apply to her. "Paperwork doesn't erase what's owed. This store was my family's for over 3 decades. You may have receipts, but I have history." There was a pause. A a kind of invisible tension, as if the room itself had leaned forward. Then she stepped even closer. "You're going to move that cabinet," she said, gesturing toward one of the custom display walls. "That structure isn't original, and it's blocking what used to be the fireplace. I expect it to be cleared before the end of the week." Marcus took a slow breath. "I don't know who you are," he said, still calm, "but you have no authority here." That's when it happened. She slapped him. It was swift, unannounced, and carried the force not of physical strength but of entitlement. So deep it bypassed doubt. The sharp crack echoed off the walls in a way that made the few customers in the store freeze halfway through their movements. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't touch his face, didn't even raise his voice. The woman stared at him, eyes glinting with something between triumph and rage. "You'll regret this," she said through clenched teeth. "You're not the first man who thought a title made him untouchable. And trust me, you won't be the last to lose everything for underestimating a woman with a real claim." She turned on her heel and marched out, leaving behind silence and disbelief. Marcus stood still for another second, processing. Then he slowly reached into his inner pocket, took out his phone, and dialed. "This is Marcus Rowley," he said when the line picked up. "I need legal to review a potential harassment case and prepare a property reaffirmation file. Urgently. Someone just walked in and assaulted me. Claims ownership. I want all title documents pulled. I want any historical claims flagged. And I want the security footage downloaded immediately." He ended the call and finally exhaled. There was no doubt in his mind. This wasn't going to be a misunderstanding that faded by morning. This woman hadn't wandered in out of confusion. She had come with intent, and that meant something bigger was brewing. He knew what it looked like when someone tried to seize control of a space. He'd seen it before, in boardrooms, at city meetings, even in family disputes. But this was different. This wasn't about money. It was about legacy, entitlement, and maybe even revenge. And it had just crossed into his domain, and Marcus Rowley didn't give up his ground. Not ever. The aftermath of the confrontation didn't leave behind silence. It left precision. A kind of hollow weight that pressed against the structure of the store, as if waiting for something else to fall into place. Marcus didn't walk in the next morning with anger or paranoia. He walked in with clarity. He didn't announce his presence to the staff, didn't send emails or hold meetings. He simply moved through his space with the same discipline that had built it. He checked every corner, not because he expected something to be tampered with, but because when someone challenges your ownership, the first response isn't retaliation. It's reaffirmation. The store was intact, untouched, but the mood had shifted. Marcus could feel it, not in the walls, but in himself. There was a kind of tremor beneath his normal calm, not fear, but calculation, a sharpening of instincts. He had handled crises before, and this had all the hallmarks of something deeper than a misunderstanding. What disturbed him wasn't the slap. It wasn't even the false claim. It was the way she spoke, the certainty with which she declared her right to the space, the way she acted as though she'd been here longer than he had, like his presence was the intrusion. That kind of entitlement didn't come from impulse, and it came from planning. By the time his staff arrived, he'd already reviewed security footage, extracted the clip, and sent it to his legal counsel along with a written report. He didn't need to be told what could or couldn't be done. He needed records, a paper trail, a timeline. Not for court, for control. If someone was preparing a move against him, he would already be 20 steps ahead. Later that day, an envelope was delivered with no return address. Inside was a printed notice titled Preliminary Claim of Historical Ownership, filled with vague references to previous tenants, legacy agreements, and so-called custodial transfers, never fully resolved. It mentioned no specific law, carried no legal signature, but was worded with the kind of confidence meant to intimidate. It referenced a property dispute from the 1950s, a handwritten will, and a family trust allegedly tied to the building. Marcus read it once and set it down without comment. He'd seen this strategy before. It wasn't about truth, it was about disruption. A psychological invasion dressed in the clothing of civil process. The next morning, his inbox began to shift in tone. Messages came in from unlisted emails framed as community inquiries. A few were subtle. Is the store changing hands? Will the gallery be under new management? Others were passive-aggressive, asking why he was disregarding the legacy of the building or undermining the cultural value of a historically significant space. The language was consistent. Too consistent. These weren't organic complaints. They were constructed. Recycled phrases, strategic timing, all just plausible enough to make someone in his position look unstable, disorganized, or worse, fraudulent. He didn't respond to any of them. Instead, he forwarded them all to his legal team, requested that they run digital traces, and began preparing a formal record of the store's ownership history. He instructed one of his employees to scan all old architectural blueprints and contracts into a secure server. Not because they were in dispute yet, but because they would be. Then came the sign. Not graffiti, not a banner. A printed placard, clean and framed, affixed to the lower corner of the storefront window. It read, "Pending historical site review. City access requested. Unauthorized modifications prohibited." At a glance, it looked official. There was a faint logo similar to the city seal, and the font mimicked government notices. But the details were off. The seal was missing key elements. The text had formatting inconsistencies. There was no department cited, no contact listed. It was a forgery, but a convincing one. Designed not to fool the city, but to seed doubt in customers, neighbors, and perhaps even vendors. Marcus removed it silently, scanned it, and sent it off. No reaction, no public confrontation, just documentation. It wasn't long before two men showed up at the back entrance of the building, claiming to be from a private inspection firm. They carried clipboards and badges that looked generic but functional. They smiled, spoke politely, said they were contracted to perform a non-invasive review of the building's interior walls and substructures due to legacy compliance queries. They didn't say who had hired them. They didn't present a warrant or official authorization. Marcus didn't argue. He simply asked for a name, a client reference, and a formal copy of their credentials. When they hesitated, he thanked them for their time and requested they leave. They did, without protest, without resistance. Too easily. He called the company listed on their paperwork. No record of an inspection had been filed. No order had been made. He followed up with the city's property compliance division. No reviews were pending. The inspection wasn't just unauthorized. It was fake. Or worse, freelance interference made to look legitimate. The moment he hung up, he made another call. Not to the police, not to the press, but to a contact within the city's registrar office. Someone who owed him a favor and could flag any attempts to freeze, reassign, or reclassify the title under obscure regulatory claims. He gave specific instructions. If anyone tried to move on 315 Madison, he wanted to know the moment the request hit the system. Still, he didn't allow the tension to show. The store operated as usual. The staff noticed little, but Marcus noticed everything. From the longer-than-usual wait time on a supplier shipment to a local newspaper quietly publishing a feature about forgotten heritage sites in his district, citing unnamed sources about ongoing efforts to restore lost family holdings. The game was playing out exactly as he predicted. Public doubt, legal ambiguity, physical intimidation masked as regulation. What unsettled him most wasn't the tactics. It was the fact that this woman, had clearly studied him. She knew his habits, understood that his strength wasn't in showmanship but structure. She wasn't attacking him with brute force. She was attacking him through bureaucracy, narrative, and the illusion of legitimacy. That's how the best takeovers happened. You didn't break down the door. You made everyone believe the lock had never been yours to begin with. Marcus didn't crack. He adjusted, reinforced protocols, increased digital security, contacted his real estate counsel to schedule a title reaffirmation. Not because he needed it, but because it would generate a third-party legal confirmation that would be on record should anything more severe arise. He had no intention of letting this become a circus. No press releases. No camera statements. Just calm, unshakable defense through documentation, certification, and timing. But the message was clear. She wasn't going away, and she wasn't improvising. She was executing a strategy. one designed to displace him not through courts but through corrosion. She wanted to erode certainty, dilute fact with suggestion, and turn ownership into opinion. And Marcus, more than anything, understood one truth. In business, once you let someone redefine the frame, they don't have to prove they're right. They just have to make it seem like you might be wrong, and that was not a position he would allow. The shift from pressure to escalation wasn't marked by a dramatic confrontation or a declaration of intent. It was marked by absence. The absence of certainty, of simplicity, of predictable order. Marcus began to feel it not as a single event, but as a series of subtle fractures in the framework he'd spent years reinforcing. The kind of discomfort that seeps in through administrative channels and professional relationships, small enough to ignore in the moment, but accumulating with the weight of strategy. The first sign came from his insurance provider, a representative called politely apologetic, requesting a verification of the property's legal standing. Not a cancellation, not a threat, just a flagged internal review prompted by what was described vaguely as recent public heritage inquiries. Marcus didn't respond with outrage. He provided the documentation, had his legal team supplement the policy with a reaffirmation clause, and requested a written explanation for the flag. He knew it was pointless, but it served a greater function. It left a trail. Everything did now. He doubled down on documentation. He had his counsel update the building's ownership certificate with a current surveyor's stamp, not because it had expired, but to reinforce a timeline. He commissioned an independent appraisal, ordered a full digital scan of the interior layout, and paid out of pocket for a third-party architectural historian to conduct an assessment proving the absence of protected structural elements. He did all this quietly with no public announcements, no confrontational tone. Not because he was hiding, but because, in cases like this, noise became evidence for the other side. His opponent wanted spectacle. Marcus gave her silence and data. Still, the pressure escalated. The following week, one of his regular deliveries failed to arrive. When his staff followed up, the distributor claimed confusion over a notification received via email that the store had temporarily closed for internal transition. No one on Marcus's team had sent such a message. Upon further inspection, the email came from a similar domain with a nearly indistinguishable typo. One additional character buried in the string. Fraud, yes, but elegant, precise fraud designed to undermine logistics and disrupt flow. He didn't waste time tracking it. He reported it to his legal team and instructed them to document the impersonation. Then he placed a personal call to the distribution manager, explaining the situation and assuring them the store was operational. The delivery was rescheduled. No drama, just friction, enough to cost him a day of business and make vendors second-guess stability. But the most direct escalation came in the form of a letter. A formal one this time, sent by courier, sealed in a folder with a return address that traced back to a regional legal firm. The letter stated that a civil claim had been filed in district court under the title of Property Dispute and Historical Entitlement, listing Karen Blick as the petitioner and Marcus Rowley as the defendant. The claim didn't demand money, it demanded acknowledgement. Specifically, it alleged that a portion of the building in question, originally used as a private commercial annex in the 1960s, had been transferred under familial coercion and never properly severed from the Blick estate. The letter claimed that a distant cousin of Karen's had once operated a now-defunct tailoring business on site, and that due to irregularities in title transfer, dating back decades, Karen was seeking a judicial review of the structure's chain of ownership. Marcus read the letter slowly without reaction. He noted the tone, the language, the careful selection of phrasing meant to imply ambiguity rather than assert fact. He recognized the maneuver instantly. It was an old tactic in legacy property law. File a claim not to win, but to initiate public doubt, to force a stay on further improvements, to signal to regulators and financial institutions that the asset was entangled. It was designed not to succeed in court, but to stall. He wasn't surprised, but he was impressed by the thoroughness. Karen was operating beyond impulse now. She had resources, counsel, and evidently enough influence to find a legal firm willing to stretch definitions for effect. That meant her attack wasn't opportunistic. It was coordinated. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he assembled a meeting with his in-house counsel, his property attorney, and an external legal consultant who specialized in legacy property disputes and claim abuse. Together, they prepared a comprehensive response. A motion to dismiss on grounds of frivolous filing, supported by 3 decades of clean title, notarized transactional history, and a sworn affidavit from the estate broker who managed the 1991 commercial acquisition. They filed the response within 48 hours, added a countersuit for reputational harm and attempted fraudulent interference, and quietly looped in the insurance company to remind them of Marcus's full legal standing and proactive defense measures. He didn't send threats, didn't call press conferences. He simply turned her move into his record of resistance. But the case wasn't the only front under fire. Inside the store, things began to shift. Staff reported seeing Karen outside multiple times, not harassing, not trespassing, just observing, standing across the street with a coffee, sometimes speaking with passers-by, pointing toward the storefront. When confronted, she simply smiled and walked away. At one point, she left a stack of pamphlets near the public bench out front. The content was vague but suggestive. Photos of the building from 50 years ago, captions like "before the takeover," and references to the building's original purpose. Customers noticed. Some asked questions, some assumed it was marketing. Marcus didn't react publicly. He quietly had staff collect and dispose of the materials and noted the incident. She wasn't trespassing, but she was imprinting her story into the physical space, trying to warp the narrative in the eyes of strangers. And then came the leak. A local newsletter, small, niche, rarely read beyond the district, published a piece titled "Disputed Ownership Casts Shadow on Local Landmark." The article quoted anonymous sources close to the situation, suggesting that a store on Madison was under a scrutiny for historical title issues and cultural displacement. No names were used, but the details were unmistakable. It referenced a prominent luxury boutique, a long family legacy, and an impending civil suit. It was a shot across the bow, aimed not at legal structures, but at reputation. Marcus recognized the tactic immediately. The newsletter wasn't the real goal, it was bait, designed to be found and reshared, to trickle upward into larger media through aggregation. He didn't respond to the article, but he had his counsel send a legal notice to the publication, requesting retraction under libel pretext. Simultaneously, he commissioned a public statement, not to be released yet, but ready, crafted with exact language denying any breach of ownership and affirming full operational authority. He wasn't going to play defense with sentiment. If he had to speak, it would be through precision. What struck him more than the article was the pattern. Karen wasn't pushing all at once. She was moving piece by piece, building a scaffolding of illusion. Legal filings, visual propaganda, anonymous articles, false inspectors. The goal wasn't to convince a judge. It was to fracture confidence, to make it harder for Marcus to function, to make others pause before trusting the structure he had so meticulously built. He adjusted accordingly. He restructured client communication to include legal reassurances, built in automated updates to reassure partners of business continuity, and activated a quiet monitoring team to track all mentions of his business or property in public records and digital forms, not out of paranoia, but out of precision. He understood now that this wasn't about a slap or even a building. It was about dominion. Karen wasn't attacking a store. She was attempting to rewrite ownership itself, to plant herself into the narrative of something she never built. And Marcus, if nothing else, believed in authorship. You didn't get to insert yourself into a history you didn't suffer for. You didn't get to rewrite legacy just because you were loud enough, rich enough, or old enough to remember a version that suited you. He didn't flinch. He reinforced, not with speeches or slogans, but with systems. She had escalated. So would he, not in volume, but in density. Every lie she deployed would be met with record. Every story she told would be countered with structure. Every inch she tried to reclaim would be protected, not by confrontation, but by the architecture of truth. Because some people think ownership is about who walks in loudest. Marcus Rowley knew it was about who never walks out. Marcus had always believed that the midpoint of any crisis wasn't defined by an explosion or collapse. It was the moment when the illusion of resolution was shattered completely, when the problem ceased to feel like a threat and revealed itself as an architecture of intent. By the time his legal team returned from the initial court hearing, Marcus knew instinctively that the situation had passed the point of procedural nuisance. Karen had no intention of backing down, not because she had a case, but because the process itself was her battleground. The judge hadn't dismissed her claim outright. Instead, the court ordered a temporary delay on further development to allow review of historical documentation, a ruling that meant nothing in substance but everything in strategy. The court wasn't ruling on ownership. It was buying time, and time Marcus knew was her most effective weapon. Still, he didn't allow frustration to infect his decisions. He intensified his strategy. If she wanted the court to review history, he would give them history. Real history, structured, documented, and unassailable. He pulled every archived city record, retrieved blueprints and property tax documents dating back 50 years, hired a specialist in real estate title forensics to construct a detailed chronology of every legal action taken on the parcel since it was first zoned. He compiled deeds, sale agreements, termination notices of prior businesses, and scanned images of all past signage that once occupied the same facade. It was obsessive but not chaotic. Marcus didn't believe in overkill for its own sake. He believed in creating such an overwhelming contrast between narrative and fact that even the most biased observer would hesitate before entertaining doubt. Karen, meanwhile, had shifted her tactics yet again. She no longer appeared across the street or outside the storefront. She'd gone quiet, publicly. But the silence was not a retreat. It was a recalibration. In her absence, a new thread began to weave through the dispute. Third parties. Marcus began receiving calls from self-proclaimed preservation consultants, from supposed journalists working on cultural legacy pieces, from legal interns asking for interviews to understand the impact of property laws on generational assets. The inquiries were always polite, always framed as academic or historical curiosity, but the pattern was undeniable. They were establishing a chorus. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was saturation. Flood the landscape with enough voices asking the same question, and the answer, no matter how true, begins to feel inadequate. Marcus refused every interview, responded to none of the inquiries, and informed his staff to do the same. Every request was logged. Every name was forwarded to legal. He knew better than to speak into a storm manufactured to distort. Instead, he commissioned a discreet third-party PR audit, not to run defense, but to monitor narrative pressure. He didn't need public validation. He needed intelligence. If the storm built, he wanted to know the moment it reached altitude. The most jarring development came not from the media or the courts, but from inside his own building. During a routine facilities check, a maintenance contractor discovered that one of the wall cavities near the foundation access corridor had been disturbed. Not broken or vandalized, subtly, carefully opened. The insulation had been pulled back, and someone had inserted a sealed envelope into the space, resting just behind the drywall. The contractor hadn't touched it, and Marcus instructed him to leave it in place while his legal team documented the discovery. The envelope contained photocopies of handwritten letters from the 1970s. Notes between two women referencing disputes over shop space and payments, with one of the names matching Karen's mother. The letters were not original. The ink was wrong, the paper modern. Someone had planted them. The move was calculated, meant to introduce discovered evidence that, if found by the right person at the right time, could seed just enough doubt to merit a deeper review. This time, Marcus didn't stay quiet. He filed a supplemental claim in his countersuit, alleging intentional tampering and evidence fabrication. He didn't accuse Karen by name. He didn't have to. The implication was clear. But even as the legal gears began to churn, Marcus understood something more critical had occurred. Karen had crossed into territory that signaled full commitment. She was no longer playing the outsider seeking justice. She was now performing the role of a dispossessed heir reclaiming what was stolen. And every action she took, every flyer, every whispered article, every planted artifact, was part of a mythology she was building from scratch. This wasn't about winning. It was about embedding herself into the building's DNA, whether the law agreed or not. The court date loomed, and Marcus reviewed every page of his defense personally, not because he didn't trust his lawyers, but because he needed to know the battle as well as they did. He read every document, every statute cited, every case precedent listed. He didn't rehearse anger or righteous indignation. He rehearsed clarity. If she wanted this to be a war of identity, He would answer with the unshakable weight of structure. The night before the hearing, he stayed in the store after closing, walking its length in silence. He stopped by the original steel support beam near the rear quarter, the only element left exposed from the original build, and rested his hand against the cold metal. It wasn't sentimentality. It was calibration, a reminder that what he had built here wasn't theoretical. It was rooted, not in memories or stories, but in contracts, inspections, compliance, tax filings, and quiet mornings where he swept the floor before the staff arrived. That was ownership. And no matter how elaborate her story became, no matter how many names she attached to old paper, or how many nostalgic visuals she deployed, she couldn't erase that. She could only distort the surface, only make others doubt the clarity of what had already been written in stone. But Marcus had lived his life building foundations beneath noise. And he wasn't going anywhere. There were moments in conflict where strategy no longer hinged on legality or logic, but on the raw stamina to outlast the other side's obsession. Marcus recognized this as the nature of escalation, not the kind that unfolded through courtrooms or email threads, but the kind that grew, like a sickness, into the muscles of daily operations. Karen had already moved past the narrative phase, past the whisper campaigns and the performative gestures of heritage preservation. Now she was targeting the lifeblood of the store itself, not with overt sabotage, but with bureaucratic entanglements so layered and misaligned that they threatened to throttle functionality altogether. The first sign came in the form of a routine city inspection that wasn't scheduled by Marcus or anyone on his staff. A uniformed agent arrived early in the morning, clipboard in hand, citing a formal complaint submitted under anonymous signature. The accusation was vague but dangerous. Suspected unpermitted structural changes impacting egress safety and customer circulation. Marcus, though blindsided by the visit, had nothing to hide. The inspector was professional, even apologetic, but clearly under obligation to follow through. He performed a full walkthrough of the property, documented exits, access points, storage areas, and spacing compliance. Marcus provided all permits, current, signed, and in order, and offered scanned architectural plans. The inspector left without incident, but not without consequence. A pending notice was posted to the digital city log, indicating the address was under review, which triggered a temporary freeze on his renewal application for the store's extended use permit, despite full compliance. It wasn't punitive, it was procedural, but Marcus understood that was the exact point. Karen hadn't filed the complaint herself, at least not directly. She had learned to weaponize the system's inertia. If she could prompt enough small slowdowns, each wrapped in official language, the store would begin to lose its efficiency from within. Then came the permits. One of Marcus's plans for the upcoming quarter involved expanding the rear showroom to include an interior installation space, something subtle but essential to his long-term vision. The paperwork had been submitted months in advance, all by the book, all confirmed. Yet the city planner assigned to the case now flagged the project for historical proximity concerns. The note was brief, pending determination of surrounding heritage claims. It made no legal sense. There was no registered historic designation on the block, no preservation orders or flag developments. But the moment such language entered the database, the process slowed to a crawl. Marcus reached out personally to the director of planning, who expressed sympathy but noted his hands were tied while the dispute remained listed on active docket status. It didn't matter that Karen's case had no standing. The system didn't differentiate between credible claims and creative fiction. It moved at the same pace regardless. Meanwhile, Karen's influence was growing more localized. Marcus received reports from neighboring business owners that she had been attending informal meetings in the area, introducing herself as the rightful successor to the Blick property lineage, describing Marcus as a transitional figure, someone who had helped preserve the space, but was not part of its final form. It was surreal. How a woman with no documentation, no authority, and no proven claim had found a way to fold herself into the narrative fabric of the block. A few owners had brushed her off as eccentric, but others, sensing opportunity or drawn by sentiment, began to echo her tone in passing conversation. Marcus wasn't being accused of anything concrete. He was simply being subtly repositioned. No longer the owner, just a caretaker, someone in charge for now. It was psychological displacement at the community level, and it was working in increments. And then it got personal. A letter was delivered to Marcus's home, not his store. It was handwritten, unmarked, and anonymous. Inside were printed photographs, candid shots of the store's staff, taken from across the street, blurry images of his delivery van, a wide shot of Marcus himself speaking with one of his designers in the loading bay. There were no threats, no captions, just images. A silent announcement that someone had been watching, tracking, compiling. He didn't show the staff. He didn't mention it to his board. He reported it to his lawyer and had the original scanned and sealed. It wasn't enough for a restraining order, but it confirmed what he already suspected. This was no longer about legal outcomes. This was now a siege, slow and deliberate, designed to make him question whether ownership was worth the energy required to defend it. Still, Marcus didn't flinch. He adapted. He hired a private compliance consultant to oversee all building interactions and serve as an independent witness during any inspections. He initiated an internal protocol shift, documenting all visits, all deliveries, all contacts with external agents or contractors. He even instructed staff to wear discreet audio recorders when engaging with unfamiliar individuals who asked questions about the business. Not because he was paranoid, but because he refused to be outmaneuvered by the illusion of authority Karen so frequently wore like perfume. He also made one strategic change that marked a shift in tone. He retained a former federal mediator, not for press, not for court, but to be present during any future interactions should Karen or her representatives attempt direct contact. The move wasn't about escalation, it was about deterrence. Karen thrived in ambiguity, in the grayness between public memory and procedural oversight. Marcus's answer was to install hard lines in soft spaces. Every encounter now would be witnessed, logged, and eligible for review. The next ripple hit his staff. 2 of his employees were approached at a nearby cafe by a woman posing as a documentary researcher. She asked questions about the store's transition, referenced a new direction, and claimed to be filming a piece on family-owned commercial properties reclaiming their roots. One of the staff members, unaware of the context, answered vaguely, believing it to be harmless. The other, suspicious, notified Marcus. A day later, a blog post appeared, unauthorized, low traffic, but tactically written, titled, "When History Walks Back In, The Quiet War Over a Downtown Corner." The article featured generic photos of the block, quotes from anonymous employees, and mentioned conflicting visions for the space's future. It didn't name Marcus. It didn't need to. It did something far more dangerous. It blurred him out. That night, Marcus called a full staff meeting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He laid out the events, the strategy behind them, and the reasons why silence was no longer safety. He told them what this was, not a business dispute, but an identity conflict cloaked in legal costume. And he told them plainly that the only way to hold ground was not through retaliation, but through unity, discipline, and unwavering clarity of purpose. They listened, some with concern, some with fierce loyalty, but all with understanding. And that was enough. Because Marcus Rowley wasn't just defending a business, he was defending the right to hold something built through effort against someone who wanted to replace memory with myth. He didn't need sympathy. He needed precision. And if Karen thought she could rewrite the ending, she was going to learn that some stories aren't edited. They're engraved. The courtroom wasn't grand. It had none of the cinematic scale or architectural menace often associated with televised justice. It was practical, beige, and worn at the edges like everything that had survived too many arguments. But for Marcus, the room represented something that few of his opponents ever truly understood. Finality. It was the place where distortion ended and fact reasserted itself. He didn't approach it with nerves or bluster. He entered the room with the kind of quiet authority that came from knowing every inch of the ground he stood on had been measured, defended, and reclaimed. Not once, but over and over in the face of relentless fiction. Karen sat across the aisle, dressed in soft tones, eyes slightly misted, her expression calibrated to convey burden rather than aggression. Her attorneys flanked her like museum curators, their expressions neutral, their folders fat with insinuation disguised as paperwork. Marcus didn't look at her. Not once. His focus remained on the judge and the material in front of him. Because this moment wasn't about confrontation. It was about compression. Everything that had been scattered, twisted, and inflated over the past months was now being squeezed into procedural form, where evidence spoke louder than narrative and jurisdiction drowned out nostalgia. The arguments began predictably. Karen's lead counsel launched into a timeline constructed around family legacy, questionable ownership transitions, and disputed title lineage. They referenced letters, historic business registrations, and even claimed that the building's foundations predated the city's current mapping, none of which was legally relevant, but all of which was designed to embed a sense of historic injustice in the courtroom. The strategy was clear. If they couldn't invalidate Marcus's ownership, they would undermine its moral clarity. But Marcus's legal team was not built for theater. They dealt in sequence, structure, and absolute verification. Their presentation, unlike Karen's, did not appeal to sentiment. It unrolled like a map, point by point, deed by deed, beginning with the original transfer of the property, the subsequent clearances, the verified title search conducted at every transaction, the zoning board approvals, the licensing renewals, and the notarized statements from the estate executor of the previous owner. They introduced affidavits, time-stamped communications, and cross-referenced tax records that showed unbroken responsibility under Marcus's name for over a decade. They included sworn statements from municipal workers, contract engineers, and compliance officers. Every name referenced by Karen's team was addressed, disproved, or rendered irrelevant under the legal definition of ownership. And then came the photographs. Marcus's attorneys introduced the anonymous envelope he had received weeks earlier. The court viewed the images, surveillance-style shots of staff, vehicles, and Marcus himself, all dated and verified. There was no direct accusation, but the implication was clear. Someone within Karen's orbit had engaged in unauthorized monitoring. This raised immediate concern in the judge's expression. When Marcus's team presented a timeline aligning these photographs with the false inspection notice, the judge halted proceedings and asked Karen's counsel to explain the connection. They denied knowledge. But the judge wasn't convinced. Next came the planted letters, the forgeries discovered behind the insulation wall. The court reviewed forensic reports on ink composition, paper age, and printing technology, all confirming the documents were fabricated within the past 6 months. Marcus's attorney didn't accuse Karen directly, but requested that the court consider the proximity, motive, and consistency of tactics used throughout the dispute. The argument was subtle but effective. If someone had gone to such lengths to fake artifacts, what else might be constructed? Karen's demeanor began to falter. Her gaze, once firm and composed, now drifted toward the table, and her hands, clasped in careful restraint, began to fidget. Her attorneys grew more defensive, interrupting to challenge procedural nuances. But they couldn't shake the impression now forming that their client was not a victim of legacy theft, but the architect of a very modern campaign of manipulation. Then came the turn. Marcus's mediator, the neutral party he had hired months earlier, took the stand. Calm and professional, she detailed every documented interaction between Marcus and Karen since the onset of the dispute. Her testimony highlighted the pattern of indirect contact, misleading public statements, and repeated attempts to engage third parties under false premises. She didn't offer conclusions. She simply described behavior, and behavior in the context of a courtroom often spoke more damningly than motive. When the final arguments concluded, the courtroom fell into a silence that seemed to stretch well beyond the walls. The judge took only 20 minutes to deliberate before returning with a ruling. The decision was direct, uncompromising, and absolute. Karen's claim was dismissed in full, declared factually unsupported and legally unsubstantiated. The court acknowledged the legitimacy of Marcus's ownership, reaffirmed all associated business rights, and went further, referring elements of Karen's conduct to the district attorney for potential investigation regarding falsified materials and impersonation of regulatory authority. A separate recommendation was made to the city council to review how unverified claims can trigger damaging procedural delays, urging reform in their complaint processing systems. Karen didn't speak as the ruling was read. She didn't argue or lash out. She simply sat still, her face blank, as if reality hadn't yet breached the walls of her belief. Her attorneys began collecting their materials, their movements quick, professional, and purposefully detached. Marcus rose slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He gathered his documents, nodded once to the judge, and exited the courtroom with the same calm he had entered. Outside, he didn't wait for commentary. He didn't make a statement. He walked to his car, stepped inside, and sat in silence for a full minute before turning the ignition. There was no triumph. Only completion. The fight had never been about a courtroom. It had never been about winning a legal argument or even protecting property. It had been about holding ground, real, psychological, and symbolic, against a force that had no respect for truth, only for the power of repetition. Karen hadn't been interested in justice. She had been interested in authorship, in the ability to rewrite the story of something she no longer owned, if she ever had to begin with. But Marcus had made sure of one thing. She would never write a single line of his history again. The days following the ruling didn't come with fanfare or ceremony. No headlines, no public apologies, no dramatic retreat. The world moved on, as it always did, quietly absorbing the fallout of another conflict resolved far from spectacle. But for Marcus, the absence of noise was not emptiness, it was earned stillness. The storm had passed, and what remained was a space finally free of distortion, cleared of the manipulations that had shadowed every inch of it for months. The store reopened to its full capacity without the procedural limitations that had hovered over its daily rhythm. The backroom expansion project resumed immediately, contractors moving through the building with a new sense of certainty, unimpeded by fabricated claims or strategic delays. Paperwork flowed unchallenged, permits were processed without questions, and suppliers who had once hesitated returned without reservation. What Karen had tried to destabilize was now grounded deeper than before. Not because of reconstruction, but because of resistance. Inside the store, the atmosphere changed in ways difficult to articulate. Staff carried themselves differently, more alert, more invested. Not out of fear, but from a sense of inclusion in something they now understood was larger than product or service. They had seen what it meant to defend a place, not with shouting or aggression, but with unwavering structure. Marcus didn't give speeches or hold meetings about what had happened. He said only what was necessary. The rest they understood in the way they moved, the way they handled customers, the way they watched the doors with quiet confidence. The weight of Karen's presence had lifted, but it left behind something stronger. Ownership that had been tested and affirmed, not just legally, but in the eyes of those who had chosen to work under its roof. Marcus didn't try to rewrite the events. He didn't erase the past months or pretend they hadn't shaken parts of his operation. He used them. He restructured internal protocols, implemented safeguards for future property disputes, and set up a standing legal advisory that could be activated within hours should anything similar ever occur again. The case had exposed vulnerabilities not in the foundation of the business, but in the systems around it. The public mechanisms that could be exploited by those willing to bend perception. Marcus learned from it all, not with paranoia, but with preparation. If anything, the experience deepened his conviction that clarity wasn't a luxury in leadership. It was the baseline for survival. Karen disappeared from the neighborhood. Quietly, completely. No formal notice, no confrontation. The district attorney's office later confirmed that an investigation had been opened, though Marcus chose not to follow its developments. He had no interest in seeing her punished. He had never pursued retribution, only resolution. She had attempted to rewrite reality and in the process had written herself out of it entirely. That was consequence enough. Her name no longer passed between business owners or residents. The building, once a backdrop to her mythology, now stood immune to her revisions. She had become what she tried so hard to project onto Marcus, an outsider, a visitor to something she didn't own. The store itself evolved, not in aesthetic, but in presence. Customers returned with a sense of respect, some aware of the conflict, others simply drawn by the stability that radiated from the place. Marcus observed without commentary, allowing the rhythm to reestablish itself. He understood that recovery wasn't about returning to what had been, but about stepping fully into what had emerged after resistance. There was no catharsis, just continuity, and sometimes that was the most powerful ending possible. One evening, long after closing, Marcus sat at his desk reviewing documents not out of necessity but from habit. Outside, the city hummed with its usual dissonant life, Inside, the lights were low, and the air held the faint scent of cedar from a new product display being assembled for the front window. His phone buzzed, a message from a longtime client confirming a major installation for the coming quarter. Marcus read it, nodded once, and set the phone aside. He leaned back, eyes resting on the original steel beam in the corner of the room. The same one he'd touched the night before the hearing. The same one that had carried the weight of the building long before either he or Karen had ever set foot. Inside, he didn't feel vindicated. He didn't need to. What he felt was alignment. Between the truth he had lived, the structure he had protected, and the future he had now secured. Ownership wasn't something he had to declare. It was something he had proven silently, completely, and beyond dispute. And that was enough.